I mean, this is all interesting, but now we're coming to something which I think is especially interesting. It'll take me a minute to unpack this, but just for listeners, we've all, I think, had the experience, plugged into the internet, and we all care about. We hear a lot of stuff from a lot of people about diet nutrition because it's a topic everyone cares about. Everyone cares about how they look and how they feel, and we want to eat what we want to eat, but we also know what happens if you just indulge in different things too much. And there's every opinion under the sun out there about diet and nutrition and what's best and why. But I think you guys are sort of really giving us a method here for maybe cutting through some of the noise. And so what I mean by that is this. You've got some people out there who say, well, I mean, humans are omnivores, right? We eat animal material, we eat plant material. It's about a healthy mix of both. Other people, on one extreme will say things like, you should really be eating an almost exclusive plant-based diet. Vegans would be the more extreme example of this. Animal protein and things like this are not good for you and you should be eating only plant-based things. Then you've got the opposite. You've got people who are the so-called carnivore saying, no, humans evolved to be mostly carnivorous, and therefore we shouldn't be eating all that much plant-based food, and it should be mostly meat. And based on what you've told us so far, if you just look at the physiological adaptations that an organism has, you can sort of tell what kind of food environment it's involved in. So for example, whether it's wolves eating animal meat, whether it's the panda eating baboon or the mountain gorilla, they have physiological mechanisms that allow them to deal with a very high protein diet. And so if we start to use this sort of evolutionary lens and think about the type of diet we, should be eating, quote unquote, or that we evolved to deal with most optimally, what kind of organism are humans? Are we biased towards being carnivorous omnivores? Or are we biased towards being plant-based omnivores? How do you guys think about that?
So the first thing is that humans, what characterizes humans, what's the most distinctive thing about our diet, historically and evolutionarily, is the extreme diversity. So that, as you've just said, the humans that subsist on largely plant-based diet, living in tropical forests, and there are humans like the traditional Inuit that live on a largely animal-based diet. And all intermediate. So we're exceptionally generalist at the level of foods. But if you think about the problem as we do, not so much at the level of foods, but at the level of nutrients, then there's a very strong signal in everything that we see that humans are a typical primate in the sense of being principally adapted to a diet that has approximately 15 to 20% of energy from protein. And you can see if you look at the central tendency, what human populations across the globe and probably throughout history have tended towards is that ratio of macronutrients of protein from energy. There are some exceptions, but as we've seen in ecology, we can also explain those exceptions because species like the mountain gorilla that evolved from a group that largely is frugivorous. The lowland gorillas have evolved specific adaptations to cope with that environment in the same way as human populations, such as the traditional Inuit, have evolved specific adaptations to cope with a very high protein diet. But the strongest signal of all is, given the option, humans will choose a diet of approximately 15% of protein, of energy from protein, regardless of the foods that is combined from.
And you'll see if you look across the globe, no human population with food sufficiency exists on less than a 10% protein diet, nor above 25 to 30%. So there is a range which is highly typical of humans in their natural environments. But as David said, we're the cockroach of the primate world. We can make use of just about any latitude and any food environment that is thrown at us, and we'll turn it into an appropriate food culture.
I see. So we're protein leveraged, so we will keep eating to get at least a certain amount of amino acids. And when you cite this 15% number, that like sort of the average person will typically get approximately 15% of its calories from protein, is that a modern human like us living right now, or is that like a hunter-gatherer living in a traditional human ecology that we evolved from?
It's kind of both. We know from randomized controlled trials that that is what a modern human, will select in an appropriate experimental environment, controlling out all the confounders. So there's something fundamental. It's a signal of our regulatory biology. Sorry, what is your previous question?
Oh, yeah. So I was just asking, is that 15% number, is that a measurement that comes from like modern humans today in the modern food environment, or is it, what we think the ancestral situation was?
Yep. So up until recently, it was believed that in the ancestral Paleolithic situation, diets were higher in protein than that. In some cases, substantially higher, and it's true in relation to extremely temperate environments. But those examples are humans making the most of a bad situation. Most hunter-gatherer populations, new information indicates, had a relatively low protein diet, ballpark within that region, subsisting to a large extent on a plant-based diet. Not exclusively, of course, hunting played an important role. We are omnivores, animal foods fed into the diet, but most populations had a relatively low carbohydrate diet. But there's one key difference between the 15% of protein that we get in modern food environments and the 15% of protein in hunter-gatherer diets. And that is another dietary component that's critically important for health and for appetite regulation, and that is fiber. We live in an environment where protein is diluted by processed foods that not only is protein stripped out of it, but fiber is stripped out of it, and also micronutrients, the range of things that in a hunter-gatherer diet we would obtain through correlation, as we discussed previously, that is also stripped out. So that combination of low fiber, relatively low diluted protein, and also palatability, sort of flavorants and things that make these foods super attractive. That's the killer. So in an environment where 15% protein exists in a complex, real food based food environment, it's very different to 15% protein in a processed food environment.
Mm-hmm. And this is really where I wanted to go next is, why can Stella the baboon effortlessly and naturally balance her diet, and yet we can't, but we know about nutrition and we're smart and we have big brains, and yet we're completely going off the rails, it seems. It sort of sounds like your hypothesis for this has to do with this protein leverage phenomenon. Our bodies are going to motivate us to eat as much as we can to get at least a certain amount of amino acids. And so if the modern food environment is sort of dilute for protein and higher in carbohydrates and lower in fiber in these things, that the reason we keep eating is to get that minimum amino acid requirement, and having that high carb, low protein, low fiber combination is literally going to cause us to be fat.
And high fat as well. It's
yep.
Not just carbs. Yep. No, exactly. And it comes back to what we said earlier, the protein leverages food intake. And if that translates into high energy intake, then we'll have a problem. So in a plant-based diet, or a diet which is low in its energy density and low in protein leverage just ensures that you eat enough food to gain enough protein, and in doing so, you don't overconsume calories. But if you strip out the fiber and you replace some of the protein and all of the fiber with easily digested non-protein energy in the form of particularly industrially processed fats and carbs, then protein leverage is going to leverage energy intake, not just food intake.
It's really important to emphasize that we haven't lost our ability to regulate macronutrient or dietary intake in the way that we see other species, including Stella, doing. And we've shown that. As I said, we've done randomized control trials in controlled environments where we can show that humans regulate to 15%, roughly 15% of energy from protein. And if you drop it experimentally below that, they overeat energy. In fact, in our experiment, they put on weight. And if you go above that, they undereat energy and lose weight. So we haven't lost the ability, but what's happened is that our environment has been subverted in a way that those evolved biological mechanisms backfire on us via that protein leverage mechanism.
Mm-hmm. So there's a wonderful example, Nick, when you're starting to become low in protein, there's a particular hormone that's released largely from your liver called FGF21. And in our experiments and others around the world, we've found that what that does is it turns on your protein-seeking appetite. And that means, apart from anything else, that the taste of protein becomes highly salient. It becomes very attractive. And if it happens that the taste of protein, which is umami and savoriness, is coupled with fats and carbohydrates, then we're going to be led astray. And that's exactly what's happening in the savory snack food industry, for example. And we showed this in one of our clinical trials in Sydney, where we found that people on a lower protein, a 10% protein diet, ate more calories. They did so principally by increasing snacking between meals on snacks that had savory flavor characteristics. Even though we'd controlled everything and were fooling them, essentially, we'd created protein decoys. And that's what is happening out there in the environment at the moment. And it's remarkable how little we get it wrong. So if you look over the last 50 years, total protein intake as a proportion of calories has only fallen by 1 or 1.5%. But that has been enough to drive more than 10% increase in calorie intake because of this leverage effect. And that's a pretty good regulatory response, but not good enough.
And because it's cumulative. So those mechanisms, as we said, with the orangutans as an example, they evolved in an environment where that's a good thing. You overeat fats and carbs, but we no longer have a period of the orangutan equivalent of fruit shortage. So it's cumulative, that small amounts accrue over long times to give rise to the problem.
Mm-hmm. So another thing I want to ask you guys about that ties into all of this, and this is something that not all people, but many people, many non-scientists, and even some scientists, when they think about diet and we talk about what is the best diet or what is an optimal diet, the piece that's crucial that people often leave off as the next part of the sentence is for what?
Yes.
And I want to talk about trade-offs here, and in particular, something that's very basic in biology. I remember learning about this stuff, in grade school when I learned about ecology and things. There are trade-offs between sort of reproductive output and volume and longevity. So for example, we could talk about the best diet for reproductive purposes. We could talk about the best diet for living the longest life possible. We could talk about the best diet for, getting jacked and building muscle or becoming like an elite athlete. And there's not one diet, I think, that fits all of those. I think there's going to be trade-offs between each of those things. Can you talk a little bit about some of the core trade-offs and how those tie to macronutrient ratios for things like longevity versus athletic performance and things like this?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And you can add to that, there are different optimal diets at different stages of life. So the optimal diet for an infant is 7% protein, high in fat and carbs. That is certainly not the optimal diet for somebody in their 20s, but it's breast milk, and that's perfect for an infant. Similarly, as you get into, as we've shown recently, women around the menopause have a higher protein requirement because of the hormonal changes that accompany that transition, leading to the loss of lean mass that you have to replenish in a higher protein diet. Likewise, when you get in either sex to an advanced age, your efficiency of retaining bodily protein starts to decline, and therefore you need to eat more protein. If you're metabolically challenged, if you have insulin resistance, then you start to lose body protein as well. And that's as a result of insulin not inhibiting protein breakdown as it normally would. That means your protein requirements have gone up. And unless you change the composition of your diet, you're going to be in trouble, because protein leverage will drive increased intake of non-protein energy. But you're right, these trade-offs are fundamental features of the life history of all organisms. And the most fundamental of all is between reproduction and longevity. These are two outcomes which require two different nutritional strategies. If you're going to live longer or reproduce maximally, you can't do so on exactly the same diet. You need to trade off one against the other. And traditionally, it was figured that there were sort of built-in trade-offs. If you used energy for one, you couldn't use it for the other. Now, what we've gone on to show is it's actually more, in some ways, simpler than that. These are just different things, different life history outcomes that do best on different nutrient mixtures. So across the life course, a lower protein, higher complex carbohydrate intake will support longevity, particularly during midlife and into early late life. Whereas reproduction is maximized in a whole series of different organisms on a higher protein intake. So you can, depending on what you're trying to achieve, a different diet will suit those different purposes. And these are embedded deeply in the evolution of our life history strategies. And it translates all the way through to the clinic. So if you're metabolically dysregulated, if you've got type 2 diabetes, for example, the optimal diet to intervene in that circumstance is not the same as somebody who was healthy and, let's say, lean at a similar age. We need to think of diet in a more sophisticated way. And then you add on top of that genetic variants. Different populations, different individuals have different genetic substrates, different genetic predispositions, and even epigenetics, where you carry the imprint of even your parents' and grandparents' lifestyle in your regulatory physiology and the way your genes are expressed. All of this ultimately will influence what's the precisely optimal diet for you in a given circumstance. I think you can simplify it, however, without having to get right down to precise individual nutritional determination if you listen to your appetites and put them in the appropriate food environment.
And,
that's the key thing. We've shown in several species now that as nutrient requirements change in that way, to align their nutritional intake with the optimal life history that they've evolved in specific ecological circumstances, their nutrient selection changes accordingly to track those changing requirements. And from what we've seen of human regulatory systems, there's no reason why the same shouldn't be true for us. In fact, there's every reason that it almost certainly is. So we don't need to do complex calculations. What we need to do is we need to decide three things. We need to decide what do we want out of a diet. And I think it's true to say that in modern environments, the goal is a healthy, long life, because we're not reproducing to levels. Most of us who are fortunate enough to live in medical environments are not reproducing to levels where we need insurance numbers of children to be born, because almost certainly some of those are going to be die at childbirth and beyond. We're basically reproducing to replacement values, so we don't need a high protein diet for that, but the goal is to assemble a diet that gives us a long, healthy lifespan, which is a relatively lower protein diet. The other thing to remember is that we don't need to calculate that. As we said, our biological mechanisms will lead us to that outcome. If that's what we want, we just need to ensure that it's in the correct food environment.
So let's think about this maybe even more concretely. So when we say the correct food environment, let's imagine a human being today living in America or Australia, the so-called Western world. Let's imagine a middle-aged person, 30s, 40s, let's say. Their goal is to lead a long, non-obese life. Where in food space, what does their diet look like in terms of macronutrient composition?
That would, we would guess from the experimental data, comparative data from across species, and also looking at natural human populations and age-specific mortality estimates, and we've done, and others have done a lot of this work particularly in recent years, that would be a modest, low to modest protein diet, probably around 15%, perhaps even slightly lower than that, coupled with high levels of fiber and complex carbohydrates and healthy fats. To do that, you could do that in many different combinations, of course, so you can achieve a given nutritional outcome endlessly in terms of foods and food likes and dislikes and ideologies and cultures, but you would require quite a reasonable plant-based component of your diet to do that. Animal-based proteins or plant-based proteins could allow you to do it as well, of course, but it would be a whole food, low junk food diet, which is full of healthy plant-derived fiber, relatively low in protein, of balanced amino acid complement. So that requires you to mix protein types, particularly if you're eating largely plant-based proteins, or to incorporate really healthy proteins from animal sources.
Mm-hmm. And is what you're getting at there with the protein that the amino acid distributions are going to tend to be different for animal versus plant-based proteins? And if so, can you kind of describe that for people?
Yes, so there are certain amino acids that are particularly prominent in certain foods and certain animal-based foods. The branch-chain amino acids, for example, tend to be higher in animal and in plant-based foods, but that's not entirely true. You can find plant-based foods and animal-based foods that allow you quite simply to get somewhere near a balanced amino acid complement. So amongst those amino acids, there's 20 that are common protein amino acids. There's about 9 of them, give or take, that are required in the diet. And if you get their ratio wrong, you can end up with outcomes that are undesirable. So too high a branch chain amino acid intake is known to have bad outcomes in all sorts of different ways, but is also necessary if you want to build lean tissue. If you want to grow muscle, you need branch chain amino acids. So you need as much as you need, not more.
I see. And I suppose that's where sort of lifestyle comes into the situation. So
totally.
The amino acid content by volume and its composition would be different for two identical people, with the exception that maybe one of them is lifting weights a lot and the other one is not doing that so much.
Right. Your target is different, is the way we would construe it.
And so, so one of the things I want to talk about a little bit more is, so on the one hand, in the book, you talk a lot about how basically for a protein leveraged species like our own, if you have a high carb, low protein diet, relatively speaking, that will tend to give you more longevity and help you have a longer lifespan, but it's not good for sort of your reproductive prowess. And then in the other direction, right, it goes in the other direction. A higher protein, lower carb diet is going to make you perform better on the reproductive axis, but it's going to come at the expense of lifespan. And the thing so that made sense to me based on everything you presented in the book. But it also confused me with respect to a long-lived species like humans in particular. And I'm hoping you guys can unconfuse me here, because on the one hand, the idea is, as we just said, high carb, low protein means longer lifespan. But at the same time, that's also the diet that tends to promote things like obesity and metabolic disease, and that those things should not promote long lifespans. So, is there something I'm missing there?
No. We call this the protein paradox. So everything you said about a low protein, high carbohydrate diet is true, and we are a low protein species. We have our diet is relatively, as we've already said, low in protein, exceptionally low in protein as an infant. So that fits with our being a long-lived species for sure. No, the answer to the paradox comes in two things. One is that our protein requirements change across the life course. So a low protein diet, as we just said earlier, later in life, very late in life, sort of 60, 65, well, that's not very late. I'm already there. But when you get beyond 65, your requirements for protein do go up because naturally you're less efficient at maintaining the protein that you eat for useful purposes. It's like there's a hole in our protein bucket. So it does change across the life course. But the really significant solution to that paradox is that the quality of macronutrients matters a lot. In particular, the quality of carbohydrates. So we, for example, published just a couple of years ago a really extensive study in mice, the standard sort of preclinical model for this sort of stuff, where we titrated protein against the type of carbohydrate in the diet. And we showed that, as many others have done around the world now, that if you're on a relatively, as a mouse, on a lower protein, 10% protein diet, you will be longer lived and healthier, except when the carbohydrate is in the form of, in particular, we found the high fructose corn syrup mixture, which is a fructose glucose equimolar mixture.
So exactly the thing that many people are getting.
Right.
Yeah.
So what it means is that protein leverage in a normal, healthy human food environment will maintain relatively low protein intakes. It'll get you to your target, but not require you to eat excess calories to do so because of the complexity of the carbohydrate and the matrix of fiber within which it resides. But if you put that low protein with junk carbohydrate, then you're in trouble. So the very worst diet under those circumstances was a 10% high fructose corn syrup diet. And to offset the costs of that, you had to, in this mouse experiment, we had to increase the percent protein to limit calorie intake. So if you're on a rubbish carbohydrate diet, as a mouse at least, higher protein is helpful. But that's the only circumstance where higher protein is helpful.
I see.
And it's only helpful because it's restricting calorie intake because of the protein leverage effect, which happens to be pretty weak in mice, actually. They show it less strongly than humans. They do show it, but not nearly as strongly as us. So it's probably an underestimate of the human circumstance.